All right, we are ready to get started. Go ahead and turn in your Bibles to 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians. Now, the book of 2 Corinthians is one that's hardly ever studied in Bible school because it is hard to study. You know how sometimes, and this may happen to preachers, especially this preacher a lot, but you start talking and you just start chasing rabbits. You'll start talking about one thing and then you'll switch to another subject. Then you'll switch to another subject. Then you'll switch to another subject. And then you think, oh, wait, I'm supposed to be talking about that first subject. That sort of thing. And it's not bad, but sometimes it's just scattered, especially when you're talking to a friend and you're not talking in a formal way. All right, that is, in a nutshell, 2 Corinthians. And so 2 Corinthians just cannot be outlined easily. Now, if you have different outlines of 2 Corinthians, and outlines exist, but they're all messy because it's one of those things where Paul is talking about a lot of different subjects. Adamant, not that he's angry, but and so it all mixes together. Now, you'll read in commentaries, and you'll see that there are 4 letters to the Corinthians and 3. That's just a lot of talking about stuff that doesn't matter too much to us. Read, especially in 2 Corinthians, that Paul has been engaging in correspondence. He's been writing a bit. There's a lot of problems. You have the first letter, which we don't have. Then you have the second letter, which is our 1 Corinthians. And then you have a third letter and a fourth letter. Some people think 2 Corinthians is actually 2. I think that we lost the sorrowful letter, and we have the 4th book, I think is what it is. Really, it doesn't matter. We have everything inspired that we need to have. Everything that pertains to life and godliness has already been given to us. Here is Paul loves these folks, and he's writing. So that's one of the reasons why, especially in 2 Corinthians, it's a little bit disjointed. But you run through 2 Corinthians, he covers, and he will rotate. So whenever you're reading, recognize the context is one of the 3. The first thing is the defense of his apostleship. Paul is not who he claims to be. He does not look impressive. He may be short, he may be bug-eyed. We don't know exactly what he looked like. And so they said, listen, Paul can't be that important. Anybody who looks like that can't be important at all. And so let's just not worry about it. And so the first thing that Paul's writing about is the defense of his apostleship. I am an apostle, he would say, equal with the other 12, and I have authority. The second thing that he's writing about is his love for the brethren, and they're dealing with the issues and troubles that they have. One of my favorite parts of the entire book is found in the first chapter, when he talks about the comfort which God has given us so that we can comfort one another. And I love that. I love that idea. God has comforted us through our most difficult times, and our job is to comfort other people through their difficult times. And so his love for the brothers, especially in chapters 8 and 9, is the idea of giving. The idea of giving to the church and some of the attitudes that need to come with the giving. Now, giving in the first century, especially in the passages which we read of in the Bible, was for a special purpose, and especially purpose. There was a famine which was going on in Judea, which is the area of Jerusalem, right? And if you recall in Matthew chapter 24, Jesus, in his prediction of prophecy, when he was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, said that there would be a huge famine before the destruction of Jerusalem. Well, here we are in the late 50s, early 60s, somewhere in that area, depending on when Corinthians is written, there's a famine in Jerusalem. And so this famine is causing people to go hungry. And so Paul, in many of the New Testament letters we read of, whether it be in Galatians, whether it be in Acts, and also here in Corinthians, is raising money to bring funds to Jerusalem to help pay for food and to help take care of those brethren. And so what we'll run across, especially in chapter 9, is Paul says the folks in Macedonia, that's North Greece to us today, are in whole bunch. Even though they're poor, they're giving beyond what they should be able to. And Paul is more or less implying, I'm going to come down there and take a collection from you. And when I come down and take a collection from you, recognize if these poor people have given that much, the church in Corinth is fairly wealthy, very important and wealthy seaport, which is here. The former leader of the synagogue, Crispus, is a member of the church. These are society folks. And he is saying, when I come down there, you need to have a pretty hefty collection too, so that I can bring it back as a thank you from the Gentiles back to the Jews. And so he's raising that money which is there. Now there's some people in today's church who like to point to that and say, well, that was giving for that purpose. I don't think we need to give today to pay preachers or to help the church or whatever else it may be. And while the immediate context is oftentimes talking about helping in Jerusalem, the context also today, first of all, because you love the Lord, right? But also so that we can have a church. These lights on today, now how's that paid for? Church, right? And the missionaries and the preachers go on are paid for by the brethren who give. Now, it's not like a movie theater where everybody has to give. I've been to movies lately. These things are expensive, aren't they? In a movie theater, everybody gives $10 as they come in. Price is it? How much are you supposed to give? As you have prospered. It's a return to the Lord for what he has done for you. And it's a which he has showered upon us. And so that's what you so there I am chasing rabbits. See, you couldn't outline my class because I chase rabbits. But that's a little bit of what we have going on there. We'll get back to giving here in a little bit. But anyway, well, let's get back to giving right now. Now, when should we give? Going back to the last book, 1 Corinthians chapter 6. The week, right? Everybody focuses on giving on the first day of the week. The same language is an denominations say it's okay to just once a quarter, but they sure like to give it on the first day of the week. I haven't met many denominations that say we'll only take a collection on Easter. Which in Acts 20, verse 7, 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2. On the first day of the week, each one of you should give store, right? So you look at the Greek word there, it's talking about placing it into a treasury. The church is authorized to have a treasury or a bank account in order to keep the funds. And so one of these days we'll have a sermon on giving, and we'll cover that pretty deeply, 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2. But this book was written probably about 75 days after the first book was written, somewhere in that area, just a few months afterwards. And it contains at least a better way to teach it. Doctrine in 2 Corinthians, as there are in most of, or as there is in most of Paul's teachings. It's more of a personal back and forth. I have the doctrine like you would in Ephesians, talking about the idea of grace and talking about the idea of the Lord's church and talking about the idea of husbands and wives and children and wearing the Christian full of doctrine letter. And so while you'll run across some doctrine in Corinthians or 2 Corinthians, it's more of just Paul sharing himself. First, the one that I chose is chapter 1. He says, our boasting is this, the testimony of our conscience, that we conducted ourselves in the world in simplicity, not with fleshly wisdom, but by the grace of God, and more abundantly toward you. All right, let's very quickly just run through each chapter and come up with the idea of each chapter that we hit as we go along. As I said before, my favorite part of the book, and this may just be selfishly for me, but my favorite part is there in chapter 1, verse 3, he talks about, hey, we have a God that is a God of all mercy and comfort. And he says he comforts us, verse 4, so that we can comfort those who are in any trouble. God's comforted us so that we can comfort others. And then he goes through talking about his life. He says, if I've been afflicted, it's been afflicted for your sake. If I'm hurt, it's hurt for your sake, as he's talking about himself and giving himself up to them as he goes along. In chapter 2, we see a sequel to the first book. Remember the first book, chapter 5? You had a man living with his father's wife, right? And Paul said, such a thing can't be so. You're letting it go by, and by doing that, it looks like you're glorying in it. It looks like you're proud of it. Well, in chapter 2, we read about a fella, and we're not specifically told it's him, but we think probably it is. Here is a guy who is sorrowful. Here is a guy who is repentant. And Paul says, listen, I've forgiven him because of what he's done, and I hope that you forgive him as well. One of the issues we have in the church is we shoot our wounded. You know what I mean? Some people, Indians used to do this. When they'd have somebody in their tribe who was sick, somebody in their tribe who couldn't keep up, sometimes they would just kill them. And in their mind, that was being merciful, not only worry about sick folks, okay? Which is a great plan as long as you're not one of the sick folks. Well, sometimes in the church, we run into that problem. When we have a brother who is struggling, who is hurting, we have a brother who's uncomfortable to be around, sometimes it's easier just to, as they'd say in fishing, cut bait, just to go on. And Paul says, no, when this person comes back, you make a road where he can come back to. You accept him and allow him back in. All right, here we have a making of a sermon, right? Because what happened to Paul? Paul used to be Saul of Tarsus, who was famous for doing what? And so he met the Lord in Acts 9 at the Mount, and as he was baptized, he spent 3 years in Arabia, and then he went back to Jerusalem, and what was the reaction of the Jerusalem church? They were scared of him. Now, why would you be scared of a fella? What had he done to them just 3 years ago? All right, remember Stephen in Acts 7 being stoned? All right, and who was holding the coats? Who was the ringleader? Saul of Tarsus, Paul himself. But Barnabas came and gave him a... He said, I will vouch for him, I will answer for him. It's important not only that we discipline folks, but it's back for them. Try to make it not so that their sins are excused, but when their sins are and be a part of the church again. Okay? That makes sense? All right, so that's what you see in chapter 2 as we go through there. The idea of the loved brother there. Okay? In chapter 3, you see their hearts are changed. Okay? You'll hear this quote oftentimes. We're talking about Moses. Look there in verse 7. The old law was engraved on stone, flesh, right? And so in the same way, we have that idea. Look at verse 18, with an unveiled face, we now see the glory. Illustration here of why Moses was in the... He wanted to see God. God said, I'm too great and too... Moses to see his backside as he passed. Well, the glory was so great that Moses' face would glow. And so nobody could be in his presence for a number of days. Directly on people because his face was shining so much, being in his presence. A picture of God. In the Old Testament, there was a veil, there was a covering. In the New Testament, that veil is taken away. And so in the Old Testament, you can see, but you can see it much better in the New Testament as you see the idea of Jesus and the beauty which is there. Okay, any comments? Okay. Chapter 5, jars of clay. We do not lose heart. Even though we're earthen vessels, we have inside of us what? Okay, there's an amazing treasure which is there. All right. My mom's not in here, so I can talk about my family again. Story about my granddaddy, okay? My family reproduces very slowly. All right? He was born in 1892. I think it was 04. A fella came through in southeast Oklahoma where they were living at the time. My grandpa thought it was the worst thing ever. He had never realized you're supposed to take off the plastic wrapper. He had never seen candy. He'd never seen anybody work with it. And so he put it in his mouth. The plastic wrapper was there. No good at all, right? And so that was always one of those family jokes people would bring up at the reunions and stuff. He never realized you take off the wrapper, and it's so much better. All right. People where you just judge the outside and you don't realize there's so much better about it. I think sometimes we are. We judge people by they're white or they're black, they're young, they're old, they're fat, they're skinny. That's pretty, right? Okay? We don't take off the wrapper and enjoy what's inside and enjoy what truly makes a person, which is there. That, in a very coarse way, is what Paul's talking about here. He says, you may think that I'm not impressive when you look at me. And we don't know what Paul looked like, but in the early paintings that we have of him, dating back to from the 3rd to the bald, not that that's bad. He's always bald, he's always bug-eyed, and he's always shorter than everybody else. Now, was that him? We don't know. You know, they didn't take pictures back then. And did they really know what Paul looked like? Sure. Did not seem to be impressive to these folks who lived in South Greece. But he says, listen, the outward is impressive, but inside we have treasure from heaven. And that's true, especially true in the Lord's church. All right. Of course, we have in verse 17, another one of my right? If anyone is in Christ, he's a new creation. Those old things have passed away. All things are new. Now all things are of God who has reconciled us, right? Okay, and that idea of reconciliation, that they're ambassadors for Christ, as though God were speaking through us. We implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. Then look at verse 21. He made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, that we should be the righteousness of God in him, right? Love that passage. Okay, that brings us to chapter 6, which is all about that idea of reconciliation. And so as you and I think about that idea of reconciliation, you see Paul talking about the idea of his suffering and his ministry, and he talks about that idea of being separated. Okay. We have a little bit of time, so we'll spend some time on it. Look at verse 14 of, where am I at? Of chapter 6. Do not be unequally yoked with an unbeliever. Now, first of all, let's look at the illustration Paul's using. Some of us, some of y'all, go back to the days when they plowed with mules, right? Any of y'all ever done that? Was it ye is this way and y'all is that way? Is that what it is? Haul is left, ye is right. Is that right? Is that where ye-haw comes from? I don't know. All I know about mules is they're pretty as you go by. All right. Back in those days, huh?
Did you ever ride one?
No, I have not ridden a mule. I've been on a horse. Mule.
I did.
Did you? Okay. All right. They are stubborn. Huh?
This one did all right.
Now, is that right? Okay. Yeah, I'm a city-fied boy now. All right. When you are yoking up oxen, you want to yoke up like animals. You want them to be about the same strength, the same day rather than doing work, right? And so you're going to wear one out, and actually you'll wear both of them out. And so it works better if you're going to work with two, that they both be the same strength and the same. harm, just like they did in this country 100 years ago. And so Paul uses this illustration. And he says, if you're going to be strapped to somebody, you make sure you're strapped to somebody who pulls the same direction with the same strength that you pull with. Okay? Now, a lot of people use this passage and they apply it to marriage. And I think it does apply to marriage, but I think we go a little bit too far with it. Okay? Because it doesn't just specifically mention marriage. I think it also applies to work. I think it also applies to the friends we spend time with. Okay? Be careful and same direction that you have. Now, some people take this passage right here and they'll say it's a sin for a Christian to marry a non-Christian. This is my personal opinion, and I think the majority of the world disagrees with me, but I think that's pushing this passage further than Paul intended for it to be pushed. I think if you marry a non-Christian, you're asking for it. It's probably not a smart idea, but I'm not at the point of saying it's sin in any way. Someone who's a Christian, but if she or he does not share your values, you're still asking for a whole world of hurt, which is there. Now, you go to work. If you're working at a place that tries to force you with its values to not be a Christian, you're asking for a whole world of hurt there, aren't you? Because it's faith, and the Lord is pushing another way. Okay, you go out with your friends on Saturday night. If they're not Christians, they're likely to go against your faith. And so there you are again. Situation, whether it be drinking, cursing, or whatever it is, Paul is saying be very careful with who you join with because of the problems which are there. All right, any comments? It's an auditorium class, so that's usually something we really like talking about. Okay. What do y'all think it means to be unequally yoked? Do you think it's about the same? Are we tired today?
It sounds to me like when you make choices of what you're going to do and who you're going to do it with.
Yeah.
That's where this comes into play, just about in every aspect.
In every aspect of life, the choices you make and the people you're around are going to have a huge influence on you. So you really, really got to be careful. Okay? Yes, ma'am. What part does a believer have with an unbeliever or with Belial? Does yours will go on to talk about Belial? Yeah. Okay, that's an idol which is there. Now, it's a possibility that what Paul is talking about here, when you get into direct contact or context with this, is about whether or not Christians have any role going into a pagan temple. Remember in our last book that we did, 1 Corinthians, he talked about the eating of meat and whether converted out of paganism, but they're still engaging a little bit in it, whether it be for social reasons, my wife's a pagan, so I have to go with my wife, that sort of thing, or whether it be just, hey, it's fun hanging out with them. And some people have taken the context to say, okay, chapter 1, he says, listen, it's okay to eat meat, but in the second book, he's saying, hey, be very careful in a pagan worship service because you're just asking for trouble. But I think that may be a little bit of the direct context, which is there. But you're talking about verse 15. What part does a believer have with an unbeliever? And you're talking about it from the context of marriage? Is that what you're talking about? Yeah.
Do you just apply it to the idol, or do you apply it to life?
I think it's to life, especially for us today. Of course, we don't have idolatry in this century like they did back then. Covetousness is idolatry. John ends his book, 1 John chapter 5, verse 13, I think, telling us to keep ourselves from idols. This world is idolatry. But I think the principle applies to everything we do. There may be a hobby of some sort that I could come But it may be something where end up doing things they shouldn't do. Be very careful before you put yourself in that situation. And I'm just using this because I don't know anybody in here who has a problem with this at all. I mean, I like the way you sing, but still. I know some people who love to go to karaoke bars because they love to hop up on stage and sing, and while it, right? That's the way karaoke works. You think you say, please let this song end. All right. But some people like to go to karaoke bars and sing. Well, the problem with going to a karaoke bar is what? It's a bar, right? And it's a situation where most of the people who are got, number one, your reputation, and number two, share and engage with everything else. And so if that's real careful in engaging in that hobby, because it can lead you down a road which puts you in a difficult situation. Now, that's just an illustration which I just came up with. But I'm trying to... Don't get into an agreement, into an involvement, pulls you away. Think of your Old Testament. He was trying to look religious to everybody because his parents weren't very good. His mother was a prostitute. He had no idea who his daddy was. And here he was in charge of Israel. And so he tries to look religious. And in trying to look religious, he tells everybody, look how religious I am, he says. I'm going to sacrifice the first thing that comes through my door. It's supposed to be a goat. It's supposed to be a horse. Not a horse. A goat or a cow. What walked through his door? His daughter. Okay? All right. He entered into a vow. Now, there's always the eternal debate. Did he really sacrifice his daughter, or did he just not let her marry? And, you know, we can go on forever with that. Judges is such a perverse book. I think sometimes he probably did burn her, but it's just my opinion. Don't enter into a vow where you either have to follow it and go against God, or you have to disobey it and go against God. And a lot of people get into that issue. Don't make a vow to a husband or a wife to where in order to be faithful with that wife, you have to go against God, or you have to go against your wife. And don't get a job where you're either faithful to your employer or you're faithful to God. And I think that's the application there. Be very careful before you make commitments. Be very careful before you make promises. Try to deal with godly people. Now, are there times where you have to deal with ungodly people? Absolutely. We have to work. Not everybody's Christian, especially in the employment place, right? Okay. You go through, and some of our ladies that show the most faith are those who are married to non-Christians. And we see in 1 Peter 3, 1 through 6, that they, through their life, are preachers of the gospel, trying to bring their families closer to what God would have them to be. So I think that's a little bit of what you've got. All right? Any more comment? Okay. There's always a lot of space to talk through there. That's for sure. Chapter 8 and chapter 9 talk about the importance of giving. Okay? God loves a what giver? Cheerful giver. And this is someone who is laughing crazily is what you're actually looking. A hilarious giver. Somebody who just gives, and loves the idea of giving. Okay? Very simple. Looking over in chapter 9, I took a verse. Where is that verse from? No. Should have been verse 7. Take this out of chapter 9 when you look down here. Well, it's in there. Each one should give what he has decided to give. I think it's chapter 7. I don't think it's chapter 8. All right. 3 guidelines for giving. Number 1, it should be personal. You give is a different amount because God has blessed you differently. Because where I am spiritually is different than where you are spiritually. And so your giving is defined by each one of us individually. It is a decision that you make personally. All right? Giving should be rational. Remember the old illustration. Don't be a Lent Christian, right? Digging in the bottom of your pocket, whatever's left over, I'll give to God, right? Or, I will not give God that which cost me nothing. It should be rational. In other words, you should have decided done before the time of worship, because it needs to be thought through. And number 3, it should be judgmental of ourselves. How much should you give? It depends on your heart. The amount you give is a reflection of the faith that you have. Oh, that's scary, isn't it, when you look at what we put in a plate sometimes. The amount that you give is a reflection of the faith that you have. Okay? Now, chapter 10, we see Paul's self-description. He talks about the warfare. He says, verse 7, don't look at that outward appearance. And he said, but instead consider yourself. And he talks about the importance of glorying in the Lord in the very last verse. Chapter 11, the idea of his ministry and the boasting in his weakness. And in chapter 12, oh my, okay. Let's go ahead and look in verse 7. Chapter 12. Unless I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations, somebody was called up to the third heaven. Probably Paul's talking about himself in the third person. This may have been when he was converted, or it may have been in the 3 years when he was in Arabia as he was studying to become a preacher. Thorn in the flesh. All right, what was that thorn? We don't know. But he prays 3 times, and what does God say? My grace is sufficient. My strength is shown in your weakness. All right, thank you very much for being here. Enjoyed being with you today.